Hello guys, welcome to new video of Spring Boot interview questions. So first question is, what are the advantages of using Spring Boot? The advantages of using Spring Boot are listed below. Easy to understand and develop Spring applications. Spring Boot is nothing but an existing framework with the addition of an embedded HTTP server and annotation configuration, which make it easier to understand and faster the process of development, increase productivity and reduce the development time. Minimum configuration, we don't need to write any XML configuration, only a few annotations are required to do the configuration. The next question is, what are the Spring Boot key components? Below are 4 key components of Spring Boot: Spring Boot auto configuration, Spring Boot CLI command line interface, Spring Boot started POMs, Spring Boot actuators. Why Spring Boot over Spring? Below are some key points which Spring Boot offer but Spring does not: starter POMs, version management, auto configuration, component scanning, embedded server, Tomcat Jetty, in-memory database, actuators. Spring Boot simplifies the Spring feature for the user. What is the starter dependency of the Spring Boot module? Spring Boot provides numbers of starter dependency. Here are the most commonly used: data JP starter, test starter, security starter, web starter, mail starter, theme leaf starter. Next question is, how does Spring Boot works? Spring Boot automatically configures your application based on the dependencies you have added to the project by using annotation. The entry point of the Spring Boot application is the class that contain @Spring Boot application annotation and the main method. Spring Boot automatically scan all the components included in the project by using @component scan annotation. What does @Spring Boot application annotation do internally? The Spring Boot application annotation is equivalent to using configuration, enable auto configuration and component scanning with their default attributes. Spring Boot enables the developer to use a single annotation instead of using multiple. But as we know, Spring provides loosely coupled features that we can use for each annotation as per our project need. Explanation of the all annotation in easy way. Configuration: use the annotation to set up Spring beans and configuration. @enable auto configuration, this annotation allows Spring Boot to automatically configure based on the class path. @components can apply the annotation to the show Spring where to look for components to manage as beans. Next question is, how does a Spring Boot application get started? Just like any other Java program, a Spring Boot application must have a main method. This method serves as an entry point which invokes the Spring application's run method to bootstrap the application. Like @Spring Boot application, we are using this annotation. After that, we are writing our main method and we have a run method in our program. So this is the entry point of the this application. What are the starter dependencies? Spring Boot starter is a Maven template that contains a collection of all relevant transitive dependencies that are needed to start a particular functionality. Like, we need to import Spring Boot starter web dependency for creating a web application. Like dependency group ID, org Spring framework.boot, group ID close, artifact ID like Spring Boot starter web. This is artifact ID and close dependencies. What is Spring Initializer? Spring Initializer is a web application that helps you to create an initial Spring Boot project structure and provides a Maven or Gradle file to build your code. It solves the problem of setting up a framework when you are starting a project from scratch. What is Spring Boot CLI and what are its benefits? Spring Boot CLI is command line tool that provides a fast and efficient way to develop Spring Boot applications. It allows developer to write, test and run Spring Boot applications directly from the command prompt. Benefit of Spring Boot CLI: rapid prototyping. It enables quick experiment of the Spring Boot projects without the need of setting up a full-fledged project structure. Auto configuration. It offers automatic configuration of Spring project, reducing the need of exhaustive manual steps. Dependency management. Spring Boot CLI helps manage project dependency, making it similar to include libraries and manage versions. Embedded server. It comes with an embedded server, allowing you to run your application without needing a separate web server. Groovy support. Spring Boot CLI supports Groovy, a scripting language for the Java platform, making it more concise and expressive. Command line access. Developer can perform common tasks like creating controller, running application and managing dependencies directly from the command line. Next question is, what are the most common Spring Boot CLI commands? Run, test, grep, jar, var, install, uninstall, init, shell and help. These are the commands of CLI. What is Spring Boot dependency management? Spring Boot dependency management is used to manage dependency and configuration automatically without you specify the version of any of that dependency. Spring Boot starter dependency are used for this purpose, providing initial libraries, configuration and default for each integration. Spring Boot dependency management is like having a helpful guide for choosing and using tools in your project. It makes sure everything works well together. Just pick what you need and Spring Boot takes care of the rest. Can we create a non-web application in Spring Boot? Yes, we can create a non-web application by removing the web dependency from the class path along with changing the way Spring Boot creates the application context. Spring Boot is versatile and can be used for various types of the application, not just web application. You can build command line tools, batch processing application and more using Spring Boot's feature and benefits. What is the default port of Tomcat in Spring Boot? The default port of the Tomcat server is 8080. Guys, if this video has blown your mind and provide you with some valuable insight, don't hold back, hit the like button, separate the love of sharing with your friends and make sure to subscribe for more electrifying content that's coming your way. Let's keep the knowledge train rolling. Is it possible to change the port of the embedded Tomcat server in Spring Boot? Yes, it is possible to change the port of the embedded Tomcat server in Spring Boot. You can do this by modifying the application.properties or application.yml file in your Spring Boot project and setting the property server.port to the desired port number. For example, you change the port to 8081, you would add like server.port is equal to 8081 to configure to your configuration file. Can we overwrite or replace the embedded Tomcat server in Spring Boot? Yes, we can replace the embedded Tomcat server with any server by using the starter dependency in the pom.xml file. Like you can use Spring Boot starter JT as a dependency for using a JT server in your project. Can we disable the default web server in the Spring Boot application? Yes, we can disable the default embedded web server using the spring.main.web application type is equal to none. Property set to none in your application.properties or application.yml file. This is useful for non-web application like background services or microservices. How to disable a specific auto configuration class? You can use exclude attribute of the @enable auto configuration if you want to auto configuration not to apply any specific class. Like use of exclude @enable auto configuration, you can use exclude keyword in this annotation. Explain @rest controller annotation in Spring Boot. It is a combination of @controller and @response body used for creating a RESTful controller. It converts the response to JSON or XML. It ensures that the data returned by each method will be written straight into the response body instead of returning a template. What is the difference between REST controller and controller in Spring Boot? In Spring Boot, both controller and REST controller are used to handle incoming requests. The key difference lies in their purpose. @controller, it is used when you are building web application where you want to generate and return HTML views to the client. These views can contain HTML, CSS, JavaScript and other resources that creates the user interface. @REST controller, this annotation is meant for building APIs, not web applications. It used when you want to methods to return data directly in JSON or XML format, which is common when building RESTful APIs. So if your goal is creating a web application with HTML views, use controller. If you are building an API that returns data in JSON or XML format, opt for @REST controller. What is the difference between request mapping and get mapping? Request mapping can be used with get, post, put and many other request methods using the method attribute on the annotation, whereas the get mapping is an extension of request mapping which help you to improve on clarity on request. What is the use of profiles in Spring Boot? While developing the application, we deal with multiple environments such as development, QA, production, and each environment requires a different configuration. For example, we might be using an embedded H2 database for development, but for production we might have proprietary Oracle or DB2. Even if database is same across the environment, the URL will be different. To make this easy and clean, Spring has the provision of profiles to keep the separate configuration of environments. What is Spring Actuator? What are its advantages? An actuator is an additional feature of Spring that helps you to monitor and manage your application when you push it to production. These actuators include auditing health, CPU usage, HTTP heads and metric gathering and many more that are automatically applied to your application. How to enable actuator in Spring Boot application? To enable the Spring Actuators feature, we need to add the dependency of Spring Boot Starter Actuator in pom.xml. Like dependency, this is group ID, like org Spring Framework.boot and Spring Boot Starter Actuator artifact ID. You can use this thing. What are the actuators provided endpoints used for monitoring the Spring Boot application? Actuator provide these predefined endpoints to monitor our application: health, info, beans, mappings, config, probes, HTTP trace, HTTP dump, thread dump, shutdown. How to get the list of all the beans in your Spring Boot application? Spring Boot Actuator provide /beans is used to get the list of the all Spring beans in your application. How to check the environment properties in your application? Spring Boot application. Spring Boot Actuator /env returns the list of the all environment properties of running the Spring Boot application. How to enable debugging log in Spring Boot application? Debugging logs can be enabled in three ways. We can start the application with debug switch. We can set the logging.level.root is equal to debug property in application.properties file. We can set the logging level of the root logger to debug in supplied logging configuration file. Where do we define properties in Spring Boot application? You can define both application and Spring Boot related properties into a file called application.properties. You can create this file manually or use Spring Initializer to create this file. You don't need to do any special configuration to instruct Spring Boot to load this file. If it exists in class path, then Spring Boot automatically loads it and configure itself and the application code accordingly. What is dependency injection? The process of injecting dependent bean object into targeted bean object is called dependency injection. Setter injection. The IOC container will inject the dependent bean object into the targeted bean object by calling the setter method. Constructor injection. The IOC container will inject the dependent bean object into the targeted bean object by calling the target bean constructor. Field injection. The IOC container will inject the dependent bean object into the targeted bean object by reflection API. So last question, what is an IOC container? IOC container is a framework for implementing automatic dependency injection. It manages object creation and its lifetime and also inject dependencies into the class. That's all for today's exploration of Spring Boot top interview questions. In next video we'll dive into more advanced question. If you found this video helpful and want more, stay tuned for the upcoming part 2. Don't miss out. Hit the subscribe button and be prepared for level up of Spring Boot knowledge. Keep coding, keep learning, and I will catch you in next video. Thank you so much guys.